The hospital corridors were always busy, filled with the sounds of footsteps, machines beeping, and quiet conversations between doctors and nurses. In the middle of all this stood a woman who everyone respected. She was a nurse with gentle hands and a heart that seemed bigger than her own life. People admired her for her patience and her willingness to help anyone who was suffering, no matter how difficult the case might be. She had been working for years, yet she still treated every patient with the same care as if they were her own family. Her name was often whispered with love among patients because she always wore a warm smile, even on the hardest days. For her, nursing was not just a job. It was a calling, a purpose she believed was given to her to make a difference in the lives of those who felt forgotten or broken. She didn't have much herself. She lived a modest life in a small apartment, where she often returned home late at night, exhausted from her shifts. But despite her own struggles, she never allowed them to affect the kindness she showed at work. One evening, while finishing her rounds, she was asked to look after a new patient who had just been brought in. The patient was a man in his late 50s, paralyzed after a severe accident. He was silent, unable to move much, and had an expression that showed both pain and hopelessness. Many nurses hesitated to take his case because they thought it would be too difficult. Caring for someone who was paralyzed required more time, energy, and emotional strength than most could give. But when she saw him lying there, unable to even lift his hand, her heart felt heavy. She stepped forward without thinking twice and agreed to be his nurse. From the first day, she noticed how withdrawn he was. He rarely looked at anyone, and he never spoke. It seemed like he had given up on life completely. But she didn't let his silence push her away. Instead, she began to talk to him gently, telling him about small things, the weather outside, what was happening in the hospital, and even little stories about her childhood. She knew he might not respond, but she believed that her voice and presence could at least bring some comfort. Every morning she would come in early to check on him before her shift even officially began. She adjusted his pillows, made sure his blanket was comfortable, and carefully cleaned his face and hands. She fed him slowly and patiently, always encouraging him even though he couldn't chew or swallow easily. There were days when he turned his head away, refusing to eat, but she never gave up. She would smile softly and try again until he finally allowed her to help him. Other staff members sometimes told her that she was doing too much, that she was giving more time to this one patient than to others. But she never listened. In her eyes, he needed her more than anyone else. She couldn't bear the thought of him lying there all day, staring at the ceiling with no one to make him feel human again. So she gave him her best, even if it meant staying longer after her shift or skipping her own breaks. At home, she was often tired, but when she thought about him, she felt a sense of peace. She reminded herself that her sacrifices were worth it if they brought even a small bit of comfort to someone in pain. She never saw her work as a burden. Instead, she saw it as a blessing that she had the chance to care for someone who couldn't care for themselves. Weeks passed, and though the man remained silent, she began to notice tiny changes. When she adjusted his blanket, he no longer frowned. When she spoke softly to him, his eyes seemed to follow her. Once, when she told him a funny story about a child patient who had made her laugh, she thought she saw the faintest curve of a smile on his lips. It was so small that others might not have noticed, but she did. That was enough to give her hope that her care was slowly reaching his heart. Her days were not easy. She had her own challenges outside the hospital. Bills stacked up on her kitchen table, and there were nights when she had to eat nothing but bread and tea. Her family worried about her, telling her she needed to think about herself for once instead of pouring everything into her work. But she never complained. She believed that life was not just about earning money or living in comfort. It was about touching lives in ways that truly mattered. One afternoon, while changing his sheets, she spoke to the patient as usual. "You know," she said gently, "I believe everyone has a reason to keep going, no matter how dark life feels. Sometimes you just need one person to believe in you. She didn't expect him to respond, but for the first time, his eyes met hers directly. They were filled with a mix of sadness and something else she couldn't quite read. But that look alone gave her strength to keep going. Every night, before leaving the hospital, she stopped by his bed, even if it was not her duty. She would whisper, "Good night. Tomorrow will be a better day." Sometimes she left small flowers on the table beside him, picked from her own balcony garden. They weren't much, just simple blooms she grew in pots, but she hoped they would brighten his room. Other patients began to notice her devotion. Some of them said she had a gift, a rare kind of patience that no money could buy. Doctors praised her too, but she never sought recognition. She only smiled and said, "He just needs someone to stay." Her life was becoming more difficult financially, and her body often ached from the long hours. Yet, she continued with the same dedication. She reminded herself that pain was temporary, but kindness could last forever. She often thought about how lonely he must feel, unable to move, unable to speak, perhaps wondering if life was still worth living. And that thought made her vow never to abandon him, no matter how tired she was. Though she had no idea of his past or who he had been before the accident, she treated him with the same respect she would give anyone else. She never imagined he had lived a different life outside the hospital walls. To her, he was simply a man who needed her care, and that was enough for her to give her everything. Her colleagues sometimes shook their heads, saying she was too soft-hearted, that she should not sacrifice so much for someone who might never recover. But she would smile and reply, "If we only help people when it is easy, then what is the meaning of compassion?" And so, day after day, she walked into his room, bringing light into a place that would otherwise feel like darkness. She spoke to him, cared for him, and believed for him, even when he had no strength to believe for himself. She had no idea that her kindness was planting seeds that would one day change both their lives forever. Days slowly turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the nurse's devotion never faded. Every morning she walked into the hospital with the same quiet strength, carrying hope in her heart even when her body was tired. For her, the patient had become more than just another person under her care. He was someone whose life had value, someone who deserved to feel human again despite being trapped inside a body that refused to move. Her sacrifices began to grow deeper. She often stayed long after her shift was over. Other nurses would clock out and hurry home to their families, but she would remain by his bedside, making sure his needs were met. Sometimes she read books aloud to him, sometimes she played soft music, and other times she simply sat quietly, letting him know that he was not alone. She believed that even silence could be healing when shared with someone who cared. Her own life outside the hospital was becoming more difficult. She had fewer hours to rest, and the little money she earned seemed to vanish on bills and medicines she sometimes bought herself to make his recovery easier. She gave up her weekends with friends, her family gatherings, and even her own health at times, just so she could spend more time by his side. Many nights she returned home with aching feet and swollen hands, but she never complained. She told herself that he needed her more than she needed comfort. The patient, though silent most of the time, had begun to notice everything. He saw the way she carefully tucked in his blanket, the way she wiped his forehead gently, and how she always tried to make him laugh even when she knew he couldn't respond. At first, he had thought she was just doing her job. But as days went by, he realized she was giving far more than what was expected. He saw the tired lines on her face, the faint sadness in her eyes, and yet the smile she always forced for his sake. Deep inside, something stirred within him, though he could not yet express it. There were times when her own strength was tested. One evening, after working a double shift, she was so tired that she almost fainted in the hallway. A doctor noticed and told her to go home and rest, warning her that she was pushing herself too hard. But she refused, insisting that she had to check on her patient before leaving. She dragged herself back into the room, sat down beside him, and whispered, "I'm still here. Don't worry, I won't leave you." Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but her words carried a promise she never broke. Some of the hospital staff thought she was being foolish. They said she was giving away too much of her life for someone who could never repay her. But she didn't see it that way. In her mind, kindness was never wasted. Even if the world never saw her sacrifices, even if he never knew the full extent of what she was giving up, she felt it was still worth it. She often reminded herself that true compassion wasn't about being recognized, it was about doing what was right when no one else would. Her sacrifices reached beyond her work hours. There were times when she used her own money to buy small things to make him more comfortable: a softer blanket, better soap for his skin, even a radio so she could play calming music for him. She had very little for herself, but she always found a way to give. Sometimes she went without new clothes or skipped meals so she could save enough to bring him something that might ease his loneliness. She also became his voice when he could not speak. Whenever the doctors came in, she would explain his small reactions, the tiny changes she noticed that no one else did. "He blinked twice when I asked if he was thirsty," she would say. Or, "His eyes followed the sound of the music today." Her attention to these details made the doctors take him more seriously, and it gave him a chance to be seen as more than just a silent patient in a bed. There was one moment that stayed in her heart. One afternoon, while feeding him carefully with a spoon, she noticed a tear sliding down his cheek. At first, she thought something was wrong and quickly checked his tubes and monitors. But everything was normal. Then she realized he was crying. She gently wiped the tear and said softly, "It's okay. You're not alone anymore. I'll take care of you." Though he couldn't say it, deep inside he felt her words reach him. It was the first time in a long while that he felt someone truly cared, not for what he had or who he used to be, but simply because he was human. Her sacrifices did not go unnoticed by her own family. They often scolded her for working too much, for giving all her time and energy to someone who wasn't even related to her. They reminded her that she was neglecting her own life, her own dreams, and even her health. But she simply smiled and told them, "Sometimes, helping one person can mean more than living for yourself." She meant every word. She lived each day with a quiet strength, even when her body screamed for rest. She gave up her chances to study further, to take promotions, and even to spend time finding happiness for herself. She knew she was sacrificing everything, but in her heart, it felt right. She often whispered prayers over him while adjusting his bed or covering him at night. She asked God to give her strength to continue, and she asked for healing for him, even when the doctors doubted he would ever recover fully. Her friends stopped inviting her out because she was always too busy. She missed birthdays, weddings, and family dinners, all because she chose to stay by her patient's side. Yet, she never regretted it. Whenever she saw him open his eyes in the morning, whenever she noticed the faintest sign of life returning to him, it gave her hope and reminded her why she was doing it all. For her, the greatest sacrifice was not the loss of time or money. It was the emotional weight she carried every day. She carried his pain as if it were her own. She felt his silence, his loneliness, and his despair, and it often brought tears to her eyes when she was alone. But she never let him see her sadness. In front of him, she was always strong, always smiling, always hopeful. She wanted him to believe that life was still worth holding on to, even if he couldn't see it yet. Every act of sacrifice was done with love, not expectation. She never once thought about rewards or recognition. She never wondered if he was rich or poor, important or forgotten. To her, he was simply a man in need, and she had promised herself that she would not fail him. What she didn't know was that her endless sacrifices were slowly breaking the walls around his heart. Inside him, emotions he had buried long ago were starting to return. He began to wonder why she cared so much, why she gave up everything for him. He didn't yet know how to tell her, but the truth was that her kindness was saving him, piece by piece, day by day. And while she believed she was giving him everything, she had no idea that her sacrifices were about to bring her a future she could never have imagined. Life was becoming harder for the nurse as the days stretched into months. She had already given so much of herself to her paralyzed patient, but her sacrifices were now beginning to take a toll on her in ways she could not hide. The bills at home were piling up faster than she could pay them. Her rent was overdue, and there were days when she had to choose between paying for electricity or buying proper groceries. Many nights she ate only bread with a cup of tea, reminding herself that her patient's comfort came first. At the hospital, her co-workers noticed her exhaustion. Her once bright eyes now carried shadows of sleepless nights, and her body seemed weaker with every passing week. Yet, she still greeted everyone with a smile. Whenever someone asked her why she was pushing herself so hard, she answered softly, "Because he needs me more than I need rest." It was her simple truth. The patient, though still unable to move freely, had started to notice more of her struggles. He observed the way her hands trembled slightly when she fed him, the way she leaned against the chair as if she was carrying a heavy weight, and the tiredness in her voice when she whispered prayers for him late at night. He could not speak to comfort her, but inside, his heart ached at the thought that she was suffering for his sake. Her family, too, began to worry deeply. They asked her why she was giving so much to a man who could not give her anything back. They begged her to think of herself, to slow down, to let someone else handle his care for a while. But she shook her head every time. "I cannot leave him," she said firmly. "He has no one else. If I stop, who will stay by him?" Her family grew frustrated, but deep down, they also knew this was who she was, a woman who would sacrifice everything if it meant easing the pain of another. There were times when her health nearly gave way. One winter evening, she developed a fever but still went to the hospital, refusing to take a day off. She walked into his room with her usual soft smile, even though her body was weak. As she sat beside him, adjusting his blanket and wiping his forehead, she whispered, "Don't worry, I'm fine." But in reality, she wasn't. She coughed quietly into her sleeve, making sure he wouldn't see her weakness. Her patient, however, noticed. His eyes followed her every move, and for the first time, he wished with all his heart that he could speak, that he could tell her to rest. Her struggles grew not only in her health but also in her social life. Her friends stopped calling her because she was always too busy or too tired to join them. She missed weddings, birthdays, and gatherings, each time choosing her patient over her own joy. Loneliness crept into her life, but she accepted it. To her, the emptiness in her personal life was a small price to pay compared to the comfort she could bring to the man lying helpless in his hospital bed. Yet, despite the hardships, there were small moments that kept her going. Sometimes, when she spoke to him, she saw his eyes glisten as though he wanted to respond. Other times, she noticed tiny movements in his fingers or lips that gave her hope he was slowly coming back. Once, while she was telling him a funny story about her childhood, she caught the faintest sound from his throat, a small, broken attempt at laughter. It was so weak that most would have missed it, but to her, it felt like the most precious sound she had ever heard. That moment reminded her why she was making all these sacrifices. She believed that inside him, life was still burning, even if faintly, and her care was helping that flame grow stronger. Every smile she gave, every word she spoke, and every long hour she stayed by his side was her way of telling him, "You still matter. Don't give up." The more she gave, the more challenges seemed to come her way. Her landlord threatened to evict her for late rent. Her family pulled away, tired of her stubbornness. Even her health continued to suffer. There were nights when she cried quietly in her small apartment, wondering how much longer she could carry on. But every time those doubts crept in, She remembered the look in his eyes when she comforted him, the small signs of life she had seen, and she told herself she had no choice but to continue. She also began to pray more than ever. Each night before leaving the hospital, she stood silently by his bed, closing her eyes as she whispered, "Please, give me strength to continue tomorrow. Please, give him a reason to fight." She never knew if her prayers were heard, but she felt a strange peace each time, as though something greater was guiding her through her struggles. Slowly, without realizing it, she had become more than a nurse to him. She was his anchor, his light in the darkest days. While the doctors treated his body, she was healing his spirit. Her sacrifices gave him something money could never buy: hope. And still, she had no idea who he truly was. To her, he was simply a man in need, nothing more. She never once asked about his past, never wondered what kind of life he had lived before the accident. She never treated him as someone who might have wealth or power. In her eyes, he was equal to any other human being, worthy of care and respect, not because of what he had, but because of who he was. But the truth was slowly unfolding within him. The patient, who had once been surrounded by luxury and wealth, was seeing the world differently through her sacrifices. He had seen people chase after him when he was healthy, seeking his riches and influence. But here was a woman who knew nothing of his fortune, who gave everything she had without asking for anything in return. It touched a part of his heart that had long been frozen. Her sacrifices, though invisible to the world, were not invisible to him. Each tear she wiped, each long hour she stayed, each time she smiled despite her own pain, these were becoming treasures in his memory. He lay there silently, but deep within, he made a promise to himself: if he ever regained his strength, he would never forget her sacrifices. He would find a way to repay the kindness she had given so freely. But for now, she knew none of this. She continued to live each day in quiet struggle, believing she was simply doing her duty. She thought she was losing parts of herself with each sacrifice, not knowing that she was slowly gaining something far greater. Her hardships were many, but her heart was unshaken. She told herself again and again, as long as he breathes, I will not give up. And with every act of sacrifice, she was unknowingly writing a story that would change her life forever. The days stretched on, and though her body grew weaker, the nurse's heart never wavered. She continued to give her patient everything she could: her time, her strength, and her care. She had no idea that a hidden truth about him was waiting to change her life forever. To her, he was just a man who needed someone to stay by his side. She never wondered about his past, never questioned where he had come from, and never asked what kind of life he lived before his accident. All she knew was that he was her responsibility, and she carried that duty with quiet pride. But inside the patient, something was shifting. For months he had been silent, unable to move or express himself. Yet every act of kindness she gave chipped away at the walls of despair he had built around himself. At first, he had thought she was simply performing her job. But as he watched her sacrifice her comfort, her health, and even her personal life for him, he realized she was different from anyone he had ever met. She was not helping him for money or recognition. She was helping because her heart knew no other way. It was during one quiet evening that the truth first began to slip out. The nurse had stayed late again, sitting beside his bed with a small book in her lap. She read softly to him, her voice gentle and warm, as though she were reading to a friend instead of a man who could barely blink in response. Halfway through the story, she stopped and looked at him closely. His lips trembled as though he was trying to form words. She leaned in, surprised, and encouraged him. Take your time, she whispered. Don't worry, I'm here. For the first time since his accident, he forced out a faint sound. It was broken and weak, but it was a word. Thank, he struggled to say, his eyes shining with emotion. The nurse gasped, her own eyes filling with tears. You spoke, she cried softly, almost unable to believe what she had just heard. She quickly called for the doctor, but in her heart, she knew that moment was not only about recovery. It was about trust. He had chosen her, of all people, to speak to first. In the days that followed, his progress grew. His words were slow, his voice shaky, but little by little, he managed to speak. At first it was only simple words: water, pain, yes, and no, but soon he could say short sentences, and each time, she encouraged him like a proud teacher cheering for her student. "That's wonderful," she would say. "See? You're stronger than you think." Her joy at his small victories gave him the courage to try harder. And then, one afternoon, as she was adjusting his pillows, he looked at her and said clearly, why do you care so much?" The question stopped her. She sat down beside him and smiled gently. "Because you deserve care. Everyone does. No one should feel forgotten." He stared at her for a long time, his heart heavy with emotions he could not yet explain. It was not long after that he decided to reveal the truth she had never guessed. One evening, when the room was quiet and they were alone, he gathered the strength to speak more. His voice was rough, but his words were steady. "You don't know who I am," he said slowly. She tilted her head, curious, but not pressing him. "I was, before the accident, a businessman." "Not just that. I am, very wealthy. A billionaire." The nurse blinked, thinking she had misheard. She almost laughed, but when she saw the seriousness in his eyes, she realized he was telling the truth. Her heart skipped a beat, but not because of his money. It was the shock of realizing that the man she had cared for, whom she thought had nothing, had in fact lived a life far beyond her imagination. He continued, struggling with each word. "I lost faith in people. Before the accident, I thought everyone wanted something from me. Money. Power. No one stayed just for me. Then the accident left me like this. And I believed it was over. But you stayed. You gave everything. Without knowing who I was." His voice broke with emotion, and tears welled in his eyes. "You saved me." The nurse sat in silence, her hands trembling. She had never expected this. To her, he had always been simply a man in need, not a billionaire, not someone powerful, not someone whose name might have been known across the world. She reached for his hand gently and said softly, "It wouldn't have mattered who you were. I would have cared for you the same way." Her words struck him deeply, confirming what he already knew, that her kindness was pure, untouched by greed or expectation. From that day on, their bond grew stronger. He began to share more about his past, slowly telling her stories about the empire he had built, the people he had helped, and the betrayals he had suffered. She listened with patience, never judging, never treating him differently because of his wealth. In her eyes, he was still her patient, still the man who needed her to sit by his bed, still the person who deserved her care and compassion. Her heart grew heavier with each story, though, because she realized just how lonely his life had been before the accident. Surrounded by riches, yet starved of true love and loyalty, he had lived in a world where everyone wanted something from him. She felt grateful that she had not known his identity earlier, because it allowed her to treat him with sincerity, free from the shadow of his wealth. The doctors noticed his recovery improving, and they praised her for her role in it. "Your care has made a real difference," they told her. But she brushed off the compliments. "It's his strength," she said softly. "I just remind him it's still there." Yet deep inside, she began to wonder what this truth meant for her future. She was still the same struggling nurse, still drowning under bills, still sacrificing everything to keep going. And now she knew that the man she was caring for had enough wealth to change not only his life but hers too. Still, she never let those thoughts control her actions. She continued with the same love and dedication, never asking for anything, never expecting a reward. For the billionaire, however, everything had changed. He had been given a second chance not only at life but at understanding what truly mattered. And it was all because of her. He began to plan silently, in the depths of his mind, ways he could repay her sacrifices once he was strong enough. He vowed that she would never suffer again, that the woman who gave him everything when he had nothing would one day be given more than she ever dreamed. The nurse, unaware of these thoughts, continued her work with the same devotion. Each day she arrived early, each night she stayed late, each moment she poured her heart into his care. And as she did, she unknowingly prepared herself for the day when her sacrifices would come back to her in ways she could never imagine. The nurse continued her routine as she always had, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Each day she came early, each night she left late, giving her patient all the care and compassion she could offer. To her, he was not a billionaire, not a man of wealth and power, but simply a human being who needed kindness. She had never expected anything in return, and she carried her sacrifices quietly, as if they were part of her duty in life. But for the man she had cared for, everything was different now. As his body grew stronger and his words clearer, his gratitude deepened. Every time he saw her tired smile, every time she encouraged him when he struggled to move his hand or form a sentence, he silently vowed to never let her hardships continue once he regained his strength. She had given him hope when he had none. She had stood by him when he had nothing to offer. And now, he wanted to give her a future she deserved. One morning, after weeks of effort, he managed to sit up with help. The nurse was by his side, supporting him carefully, her face glowing with pride. "Look at you," she said warmly. "You're getting stronger every day. I knew you could do it." He looked at her, his eyes filled with emotions he could barely put into words, and whispered, "Because of you." She smiled gently, not realizing how much those words meant. The doctors were amazed at his progress. They credited his determination, but he knew the truth. Without her, he would have given up long ago. Her sacrifices had been the foundation of his recovery. Then came the day when he was able to share more of his thoughts. With his speech improving, he asked her questions about her life. At first, she tried to avoid answering, but he insisted gently. Finally, she admitted the truth. She told him about her small apartment, about the bills stacked on her table, about the family who often scolded her for giving too much of herself. She confessed how lonely her life had become, how she had no time for herself, and how she had given up dreams of a better future because she had chosen to stay by his side. She spoke softly, not to complain, but simply to share. Her voice was calm, and her eyes carried no bitterness. She finished with a quiet smile. "But I don't regret any of it," she said. "If my sacrifices brought you comfort, then it was worth it." The billionaire felt his heart ache as he listened. He had seen people chase after him when he was wealthy and strong, yet here was a woman who had given everything without expecting anything in return. She had suffered silently while giving him life again. In that moment, he made a decision. He would not only thank her with words, he would change her life. When the day finally came for him to leave the hospital, the staff gathered to watch. He was still weak but able to walk slowly with support. The nurse stood beside him, proud and emotional. To her, his recovery was the greatest reward she could ask for. She thought her part in his life was ending, and soon he would go back to his world, while she returned to hers. She never imagined he had something planned for her. As he prepared to leave, he asked to speak to her privately. She followed him to a quiet corner, where he turned to her and said, "You don't know how much you've given me. You saved me when I had nothing, not even hope. You gave me your time, your strength, your heart. And now, I cannot let you return to the life you had before. You deserve more." She shook her head, smiling softly. You don't owe me anything. I only did what felt right. But he raised his hand to stop her. No, he said firmly. You gave me everything when I had nothing. Now it is my turn. The next week, her life changed. One morning, she received a call asking her to come outside. When she stepped out of her apartment, she froze in shock. A sleek black car waited at her door, the kind she had only seen in magazines. The driver handed her an envelope, and inside was a letter from her former patient. In it, he thanked her for her sacrifices and told her that her kindness had restored his faith in humanity. He also explained that he had arranged something special for her. She was taken to a beautiful building in the city, a place she had never seen before. Inside, she found him waiting, standing tall though still leaning on a cane. His eyes lit up when he saw her. Welcome, he said softly. This is for you. She looked around in confusion. The building was a small but modern healthcare center, fully equipped with beds, supplies, and staff waiting to begin work. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling. He smiled. This is your dream. You once told me you wished more people could receive care, even if they could not afford it. So I built this for you. It will be your center, a place where you can help others the way you helped me. And you will never have to worry about bills or money again. I have made sure of it. Tears filled her eyes as she covered her mouth with her hands. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. The man she had cared for, the one she thought had nothing, was giving her more than she had ever dared to dream. But that was not all. He also told her that he had arranged financial security for her family, ensuring they would never struggle again. He had cleared her debts, provided her with a comfortable home, and promised to support her in every step of her journey. You gave me life, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Now let me give you freedom. The nurse cried openly, her heart overwhelmed with gratitude. She had never expected anything, never once asked for reward. All she had wanted was to care for someone in need. And now, that simple act of compassion had returned to her in ways she could never have imagined. News of her story spread, inspiring many. People spoke of the nurse who had sacrificed everything for a patient, not knowing he was a billionaire. Her name became a symbol of pure kindness, proof that true compassion never goes unnoticed. She was invited to share her story, not as a tale of riches, but as a lesson that love and sacrifice can change lives in ways no one can predict. As the days went on, she continued to run the center with the same dedication she had once given to a single patient. She welcomed the poor, the sick, and the forgotten, offering them the same care she had given him. And each time she walked through the halls, she remembered the man who had once been her patient, now her greatest supporter and friend. She often told people, I didn't save him. He saved me, too. He showed me that even in sacrifice, there is reward, and even in the darkest times, kindness can light the way. Her life was no longer filled with loneliness, hardship, or struggle. Instead, it was filled with purpose, hope, and the joy of giving. And though she had once believed her sacrifices were silent, she now knew they had echoed into something far greater than she could have imagined.